Welcome back to the Be Well by Kelly podcast. This week, we've got another mashup episode for you, bringing together some of the most popular guests and topics we've ever had on the show. Where we've covered blood sugar and raising happy kids in previous Roundtable episodes, number 262 and 265, check those out. This one branches out with a wider scope of potential impact, focusing on lifestyle adjustments and daily actions we can all make for a healthier life. We touch on some of the core pillars of mental and physical health, like movement, sleep, and diet, and delve into some more complex topics like detoxing, supporting a healthy gut microbiome, fasting, and more. There's so much more to this story that we've prepared a follow-up part 2 episode where we'll cover more learnings from additional guests like Dr. Andrew Huberman, Dr. Mark Hyman, and much more coming soon. I'm so excited to bring back these 4 amazing guests. And tune in for the outro of this episode for the full bio introduction to each expert and their qualifications. We begin with Max Lukavere, one of my very first guests from episode 4. His New York Times bestselling book, Genius Foods, Become Smarter, Happier, and More Productive While Protecting Your Brain for Life, is one of my favorite books about nutrition, although it's so much more than that. Our conversation served as a sneak peek at his following book, The Genius Life: Heal Your Mind, Strengthen Your Body, and Become Extraordinary. We talked about his favorite go-to workout tips, ways to elevate your sleep hygiene, and did some myth-busting on dental floss. But this segment was all about diet, eating to prevent illness, and detox, booting the bad guys from our system.
The default state of any organism is health. People need to know that, because when you look around, that the human state, the human default state seems to be anything but these days. I mean, most people are either overweight or obese. Half the population is either diabetic or pre-diabetic, which, if you are either of those things, we know that that's actually a late marker of having chronically elevated insulin, which is wreaking havoc on your body all the while. So the default state for the human animal is actually malaise and ill health. But truly, that's an anomaly in the universe. The default state of all of us should be health. But, over the course of our lifespans, we destroy it. I think it's partially our fault, but it's also just the world that we've inherited.
Yeah. I mean, I think the more that we advance our technology and kind of the comforts of the modern society, the more sedentary people become and the more prescriptions end up in their medicine cabinet, which is so sad. It's interesting that you brought up insulin, because I think today we're seeing sort of 2 camps: the people who are just calories in, calories out, and people who are more, I guess, really worried about high blood sugar, elevated insulin. And it isn't that calories don't count. And I've seen you talk about this a number of times on your Instagram, and I'm curious if it'll be in your next book. But can you go down a rabbit hole with me on this about what you think people should be eating nowadays to prevent illness?
Yeah, such a good question. I'm so glad you brought it up, because there are these warring factions in the nutrition space. I'm not a big advocate of calorie counting. I don't think that you should need to count calories. I think that's an artificial construct. I think it's not intuitive. And the reason for that is you need tools to do it. You need nutrition facts to do it. But if you look at, hunter-gatherer populations, or even our ancestors, they were able to somehow maintain lean or relatively lean and healthy bodies up until old age without having to count calories. It's this modern concept.
They didn't have food scales.
Yeah, they didn't have food scales. So it's a modern solution to a modern problem. And the modern problem really is that we're just inundated. Our proximity to hyper-palatable convenience foods is just unprecedented in terms of human history. So we're constantly around processed foods that basically short circuit our brain's satiety checkpoints and our brain's reward centers. And they're super easy to overconsume. They're hyper calorie dense. And so it's one of the reasons why I think calorie counting has emerged as a way to fight back against that. But there are ways to maintain certainly a healthy body and good health without, having to become obsessed with calories. And in a time when, more and more people, and this better than I do, are, struggling with disordered eating and things like that, I think we really ought to look at the quality of our food first, because the quality dictates the quantity. That's what so few people understand, is that if you have, a plate of ultra processed foods in front of you, which is what most people are eating most of the time, 60% of the calories that most people consume your average person consumes come from what are called ultra-processed foods. So these are like food-like products. These are foods that are found in the aisles of your supermarket.
Yeah.
They're shelf-stable. They don't go bad. Preservative-laden. Yeah. Tons of added sugar, unhealthy fats. Those are the kinds of foods that most people are eating most of the time. And if you put those kinds of foods in front of a person, they're going to eat, when eating until satiety, until satiated, they're going to end up overindulging and eating more calories than they burn throughout the day easily. You can easily accomplish that because these foods are so calorie dense. They're usually so delicious. They're like mouth porn for the human animal, right? And they also have a negative impact on the body's metabolism. They're at a metabolic disadvantage because they're so easy to digest, because like industrial processing has basically
they're completely acellular. They've been broken down into flours. They're going to digest into a slurry of candida and yeast feeding products.
100%.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. And it's funny because I sit down with clients all the time and they beat themselves up because they can't stop eating whatever, their kids' treats, or the pizza comes and they eat the whole box. And I'm like, if I ordered that pizza too, I would probably eat the whole pizza. It's not that you don't have the willpower. It's that you're in overdrive and you're not going to feel satisfied until that box is done. But like if I put a huge piece of salmon on your plate, maybe let's say I put like 10 ounces of salmon on your plate, you're going to stop when you feel full. You're not going to finish that whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's pretty amazing the way that the body works to regulate when you're eating whole foods.
1,000%. Yeah. I mean, so they've done this actually over the past year. There was a study that came out of the National Institute of Health. Kevin Hall is the researcher. I'm sure you've seen the study, but it was really great. They found it was a really rigorously controlled crossover trial where they found that people, when exposed to these, when basically given nothing but ultra processed foods to eat and allowed to eat to satiety, so like an ad libitum feeding system where they were allowed to just basically eat whatever they wanted and then stop as a human being naturally would. They ended up eating a 500 calorie surplus when given these ultra processed foods. And 500 calories per day extra doesn't seem like a lot, but over the course of a week, if you're eating 500 calories a day extra every day of the week, that's a pound of fat that you're gaining that week, which nobody wants, right? That extra pound of fat. But then in the crossover, what they did was they basically gave the same people whole foods, or at least minimally processed foods. And they found that their appetites were able to easily regulate themselves. And I believe they ate at a calorie deficit of about 300 calories, which is like weight loss right there. Yeah. So I'm not saying that calories don't matter. They obviously matter. But I don't think that we should be thinking about calories, right? There's so many other things in life that we ought to think about. And there's so many other areas of our lives where, there's room for improvement too. So why make more work for yourself at the end of the day?
Thinking about toxins and what we come in contact with, I think it can be really overwhelming for anyone to start from scratch. I mean, just even going into my mom's household and we're talking about, from her cleaning supplies to lotions that seem, that are marketed to seem like they're low in toxins and natural, like I'm in a name drop, like an Aveeno or something like that, where you're like, oh, oatmeal and it's made from garbanzo beans, or they like put plants on the outside of the packaging. My mom's trying to pick these healthy ingredients and I'm downloading the Think Dirty app and I'm scanning everything for her, the EWG app. And I'm like, endocrine disrupting chemicals, like known carcinogens. What have you uncovered in your research and where can people start? And what are your favorite ways to like clean out those toxins that I guess would be like low hanging fruit? Like, why not?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I try to do a pretty thorough lay of the land in the book, The Genius Life. So I came into contact with this organization. It's called the Endocrine Disruption Exchange, which I think people should check out and support. It's a science-based organization. Really, their sole mission is to raise awareness about all of the many potential endocrine disrupting compounds that are present in the environment. And there are about 1,400. It's sort of like the most wanted list, right, of chemicals that have the ability to disrupt our system of hormones. There's about 1,400 of them that they've identified. And so there's no way that you're going to be able to eliminate all 1,400 from your life. It's impossible. And in fact, you've likely been exposed to many of these types of chemicals the entirety of your life. The Environmental Working Group actually found about 287 known industrial chemicals in utero, in the wombs of like women. It was a random sampling of children across the United States. And they found that, oftentimes we're exposed in utero to chemicals that are clearly linked with development problems, cancer, and things like that. So it's frightening, but it's also empowering because, we're at a point where we can recognize some of these chemicals and minimize our exposure to them. But essentially what I think is really important is to minimize your reliance on plastic. So go through your kitchen first and foremost, get rid of plastic Tupperware and things like that.
Easy switch, glass Pyrex.
Easy switch, glass, get rid of plastic. Water bottles. So yeah, minimizing your usage of plastic, not touching store receipts when you have the opportunity to.
And why?
Well, because they're coated with BPA, which is
and all store receipts. No, you gave me a tip for this.
Generally, the ones that are heat sensitive, and you can tell a heat sensitive receipt by running your fingernail across it. And if you can write on the receipt with your fingernail, that's a receipt that you definitely want to wash your hands after touching. If you wash your hands after touching, it's not a big deal. But I think most people underappreciate the amount of hand to mouth behavior that they exhibit throughout the day, which kind of makes us sound like animals, but we are animals.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're touching these store receipts and you're rubbing your eyes or your face or you're eating foods with your hands, that BPA, which is bisphenol A, which is a known xenoestrogen, it acts like estrogen in your body, is entering circulation. And for an adult, that might not necessarily be the biggest deal, although we have no reason to believe that that's safe. For a child, for a developing human being, that could have lifelong implications potentially, because your hormones are not just there to guide, libido, sexual function, hunger, metabolism, and things like that, and brain function, which is like, that's a lot. That's like everything.
Yeah.
But
hormones are queen. That's what I like to say.
Yeah.
It's literally, it dictates your life.
Dictates your life.
It's unbelievable. Yeah.
And they guide development when you're a child. So if you're a little, if you're a parent and you're touching these receipts and then you're holding the hand of your baby, that's something that I would definitely become more conscious of, and just make sure that you're washing your hands after you touch those receipts, and make sure that your children are washing their hands as well.
Okay. No plastic, no Teflon, no receipts. What else in your life are you changing to eliminate toxins?
Well, I definitely make efforts to detox as best I can. I'm a big fan of sweating regularly, so sauna use. Sweating is a major modality by which we excrete a lot of these toxins. It comes out in our sweat. It also, toxins come out in our pee, poop, and perspire. Those are the three P's of healthy detoxification. Crucially important. So for people that are constipated, for people who are dehydrated, and for people who don't regularly sweat, you're accumulating these toxins. And not to fearmonger, it's not that any one of them is like that dangerous that, that we should be, that we should live our lives in fear of. But it's the overall like toxin burden of everything that we're exposed to, whether it's, pesticide and herbicide residues in our produce, or antibiotics in our meat and our milk, or, heavy metals that we're exposed to via our tap water that come out in like old drains, or, if you live in a home that was painted or built prior to 1978, lead-based paints that you might be exposed to, or asbestos, there's so many examples. Like,
we just tried to do things too quickly, whether it's like industrially raised animals and produce, or just like quick fixes, which feels like the end of the 60s to like the end of the 90s. It felt like everything, we just wanted it to be fast, quick, and easy. And the side effects of that are all coming out now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Living here in LA, and like, we have our tap water, and then I use a water filter. I use a Berkey. I know you have a water filter that you like too. I think that that's like a great investment, because whether it's you're taking stainless steel or glass and you're leaving your house with your own water, or you have a way to refill from like filtered water, that's a great way to lower your plastic, even just like the contact to the food you're eating.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up water. A lot of these endocrine disrupting chemicals are ubiquitous in the water supply. I forget which exactly it was, but many of them are omnipresent in drinking water all around the United States, whether it's, PFOA or related chemicals or BPA. You can find this stuff in water. Not to mention that there tend to be high levels of heavy metals in our water. It's not like your tap water is coming from like a mineral spring. It's running through the old pipes in your buildings, and you have no idea how those pipes are maintained. So I use a reverse osmosis water filter, which I know, you use too, which is really the best way to clean up your water. And you can see the job that your water purifier is doing if you just you can go on Amazon and buy a cheap total dissolved solids meter, which doesn't measure everything in the water, but it measures heavy metals and things like that. And you'll see that by running it through that, one of these purifiers, you basically have a pretty high, you'll usually find like a pretty high amount of dissolved solids, and it can remove all of them, which I'm not saying that all of them are bad actually, because many of those solids are actually minerals that you do want, and you can add them back in after the fact.
Yeah.
But yeah, often you'll get like lead in the water and things like that.
Sure, the 3 Ps are the most memorable tip here, but detoxing is as much about what we put in, think water infiltration and avoiding plastics, as what comes out. Next up is Kelly McGonigal. From her earlier episode, number 2, Kelly is a psychologist, author, and lecturer. Her work builds a bridge from psychology and neuroscience to accessible, understandable lifestyle tips, making this conversation a perfect fit for today's roundtable. We dug into her book, The Joy of Movement, to highlight the important role of exercise for a balanced mind and body.
The theme of your book seems to really highlight how working out is sort of the antidote for everything. I felt like I was reading and it was like, are you depressed? Work out. Are you anxious? Work out.
Are you lonely?
Feel connected?
Work out. Yes.
Work out. I feel like I'm always pretty glass half full, sort of set that way. But there are definitely times where I've felt stressed or anxious or a little depressed. And, I really want to start using working out as the antidote for it.
Yes. So there are 2 ways, there are probably 1,000 ways to think about this, but let's talk about 2. One is the immediate effect that movement has on our mood and our mindset. Psychologists call this the feel better effect, which is the fact that if you go from being sedentary, you haven't moved in a while, and you move to any degree, any dose, any type, there really is no minimum threshold. If you are moving your body a couple of minutes, any way at all, most people report immediately feeling more hopeful, more optimistic, more energized, and happier. And it doesn't matter sort of where you start out, anxious, angry, bored, sad, calm, that people tend to move in the direction of having more energy and their mood being more positive. So that's the easiest effect to exploit, because if there's any movement that you can physically do with the body that you have now in the environment that you're in, you can almost guarantee that whatever you are able to do is going to make you feel better. And I often will tell people, just pick a song, because we know music is so powerful. Pick a song and do something. Go for a walk, do some stretches, dance around, do some push-ups, inspires you. But since you use that word resilient, I want to highlight this other side of how movement is such powerful medicine for us, which is how being active in the long term changes the structure and the function of your brain. And there are 2 main ways, 2 main effects that you see when people who are not really active become more active. And you usually see this change happen on the course of like 6 weeks to a couple of months. You see really major changes happening in the brain. The first is that the brain becomes more sensitive to joy, more responsive to pleasures. That being regularly active fine-tunes the reward system of the brain to make good food taste better, sunsets more beautiful, a hug from a friend feel better. Whatever it is that just brings you ordinary joy and pleasure in life, the brain gets better at responding to that. And this is one of the reasons why exercise seems to be such a powerful antidepressant. If you look, this is around the world, studies and interventions have been done in so many different countries and cultures that when you either add exercise to antidepressant medication or therapy, or you just randomly assign people who are not yet being treated to exercise or another form of treatment, that exercise is incredibly effective as an antidepressant, including for people who are severely depressed. And it's also why exercise seems to be so important for people who are recovering from substance abuse or addiction. Because with both addiction and depression, as well as grief, one of the main things you see is that the reward system of the brain becomes less responsive. So it's harder to enjoy anything. It's harder to feel motivated about life. It can be literally hard to get out of bed in the morning, in part because the brain is not telling you, take a step, something good could happen. And so exercise seems to reverse that. So that's one way that exercise makes you more resilient and increases happiness. But the other is that exercise also changes the systems of the brain that make you resilient to stress and to trauma. Again, over the course of weeks and months, you see the brain becoming literally more resilient, better able to help you handle stressful situations. better able to help recover even from past trauma or loss. And you get a brain that's basically better able to handle difficult things without falling into despair. Gosh, I'll pause for a moment because I could talk for hours about this, but I think that to understand that who you are once you've been active for a while, that your brain is both more sensitive to joy and better protected against stress. There is nothing else I've seen in the literature, and I've been looking for 2 decades for things that people can choose to do that produce psychological well-being. And I've never found anything that has the same effect as physical movement.
So on a biochemical level, what's happening in the brain? Is it receptor sensitivity? Is it more of specific chemicals?
Yes, when it comes to the reward, it's for so many different effects. So one thing you see is that you get an increase in both tonic and phasic levels of dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that often produces a sense that something good is going to happen, that makes us optimistic and hopeful, and that makes us want to engage in life. So you see an increase both in the tonic levels, that's sort of your baseline state. Like when you wake up in the morning, does it feel like, hey, there's a reason to get out of bed? But the phasic dopamine burst, that's that burst of joy you get when, let's say, you do get out of bed and your dog comes running at you and your dog starts giving you kisses and your brain is like, wow, I love my dog. You get an extra big burst of dopamine. So physical activity seems to increase both of those. So your baseline is just, essentially more optimistic and engaged. And also the little things that make you happy lead to a bigger burst of happiness.
I mean, who doesn't want that?
I know, but you also see an increase in receptor availability, which is one of the sort of the key hallmarks that you see decline in things like depression and addiction, and also in aging. So as people age, every decade they lose a certain number of dopamine receptors and dopamine neurons that produce the dopamine and also receive the dopamine to give you that feel-good sensation. And regular exercise seems to increase the biochemical availability of receptors. It's like, that's when I say that it makes your brain more receptive to joy. That's what I'm talking about. It literally have receptors in your brain that are waiting for dopamine, and they become more available. It's like if you could imagine, like you think about available body language. If you wanted to give someone a hug and their arms were crossed, you couldn't give them a hug. Mm-hmm. So when I say that your dopamine receptor is more available, it's like your dopamine receptor is opening their arms wide and being like, give me that dopamine hug. I'm ready for it. One of the most fascinating findings that made me love my body. I mean, so the brain is amazing, but the idea that made me love my muscles is something called hope molecules. And this is something that we've only learned in the past decade or so about how the human body works, which is that your muscles are basically an endocrine organ. So normally you think muscles, okay, attached to bones, they move bones, they contract so that I can lift things and push things and walk. But as it turns out, muscles have this whole other job, that they are manufacturing chemicals and proteins. And when you contract your muscles through movement, it's a signal to the muscles to push out into the bloodstream dozens of different chemicals and proteins that support our physical and our mental health. And when you exercise regularly, you have a completely different biochemistry, what's going on in your bloodstream, because your muscles are pumping out all of these molecules that reduce inflammation, that boost your immune system, that can help kill cancer cells, that can regulate your metabolism. These are phenomenally health-enhancing molecules. And some of the molecules that your muscles release during exercise, they go through the bloodstream, they cross the blood-brain barrier, and their primary effect in the brain is to function as an antidepressant that strengthens the systems of your brain that make you resilient to stress and trauma. And one of the first papers that I came across that was describing this called those molecules hope molecules, because they were sort of like I was infatuated with this idea that your muscles are manufacturing basically antidepressants, and that when you exercise, you're giving yourself an intravenous dose of hope. Like this, to me, do you not think that is amazing?
It's just so, I think one of the most powerful things that we've discovered in science in the last 10 years. And these chemicals are called myokines.
Yes. And I like to focus on the effects on the brain because I'm a psychologist. So, at the end of the day, I'm always interested in depression and happiness and social connection and all of that. But, as you point out, these molecules that are being produced during exercise have profound effects on your physical health as well. And again, it's one of the reasons why as a health psychologist, when people ask me if there's one thing I should do that's going to be good for my health, I mean, there's so many things you could do, but there's just nothing that operates at the same level as exercise.
I think it's a beautiful reminder that, these bodies are vehicles for this journey, and it's a journey and not a destination. And most of all, we're in this together, and those connections can be life altering.
Yes. And all of the joys of movement that we've talked about, whether it's helping people deal with depression, making your brain more responsive to joy, helping you connect with others, having your mind altered by being out in nature, all of those things that we talked about, the research is clear. They are independent. They do not require any type of weight or weight loss. They are the benefits of moving your body. And you don't have to fix your body or look a certain way or burn a certain number of calories in order to realize these benefits.
You knew we couldn't do a lifestyle episode without highlighting gut health, an area where Dr. Amy Shah shines. In my conversation with her from episode 16, we started there and moved into intermittent fasting, especially as it affects women. How can someone determine if they have a healthy gut microbiome, and what steps can they do to cultivate that health for the long run?
I think that we have to understand that no matter how much testing is available, currently there is no gold standard for knowing that you have a healthy microbiome. For example, you and I can have completely different bacterial makeups in our gut, but we can both be super healthy and live healthy lives. So that's really confusing, because I think a lot of people think that there must be a way to check besides just the self-check that you have. Like, are you having a bowel movement daily? Are you experiencing bloating less than 3 times a week? You shouldn't have bloating on a daily basis and constantly, and you shouldn't be constipated for more than 3 days at a time. And those are great, really quick checks. But then there's also other things. It doesn't just affect your gastrointestinal symptoms. It also affects the way you think, like brain fog and fatigue, and it affects your immune system, like a low immune system, low immunity, which is so important at this time. It can also be weight gain and metabolism issues and diabetes. So there's a multitude of different things that our microbiome affects. It's not just the digestive system. But I would say that if you have any of those signs, so GI symptoms, brain symptoms, metabolic and hormonal symptoms, that could be a sign that your microbiome is off.
So with your patients and your practice, are you really looking for those physical signs versus doing any stool testing, or are you stool testing as well?
I think that stool testings are often not helpful. I'll be honest. And because we put a lot of weight on testing in our society, like, okay, if you have normal testing, you're fine. And if you have, but with microbiome testing, like I said to you, it's so complex. You could even have some of the bacteria that somebody else has, but have different outcomes based on the rest of your terrain. So what I do is use it as one piece of data, but really it's a matter of watching, listening to your body and seeing if your symptoms are getting better. So for example, one of the biggest ways to check if you're doing okay on the microbiome front is that your energy levels are good. Your hormones are balanced. You have regular stools and your GI system is working well, meaning constipation and diarrhea are not happening to you on a regular basis. So I think that those are good check-ins rather than the stool test.
Yeah, you're definitely an MD who's known for looking at the whole person, including how they're sleeping, their activity levels, using tools like intermittent fasting, which I love that you're calling it a tool, because that's what I preach with my clients as well, is just how can they add things? And it's about adding and nourishing versus depriving and stripping away. And I think intermittent fasting is a really helpful tool. There is a lot of information out there, though, about intermittent fasting not being the best tool for women. But I've seen you use it with women. So I'd love for you to give your advice and the advice you might have for women when it comes to intermittent fasting. How would they know if they're the right type of person to use intermittent fasting, and how should they do it?
That's such an amazing question, Kelly, because I know that you work with so many women who struggle with intermittent fasting, and I have too. And I myself, actually, the first few times I started to do intermittent fasting because I read all the research and I said, wow, this is something I really have to add to my regimen. And what I did is what most women do wrong, is that I jumped right in. I thought, okay, if 16 hours is good, 18 hours is better, I can do this every day. And what happens with women is we're very, very sensitive to starvation and to stress on our bodies in that way. Our bodies are wired to detect starvation and nutrition deficiencies very, very, it's very sensitive to that because we think, we were wired to carry children, and women will see that their periods are off, or they miss their period, or they're having other issues with their cycle due to intermittent fasting. And what that's a sign that this is too stressful to your body. I tell women, I said, if there's a change to your cycle, that's a feedback signal from your body that this is either not for you, too aggressive for you. There's something off there. And when I speak to women, often I hear that story that they did it aggressively because they wanted to see the results and feel good about around it. But they noticed that it started to impact their energy. It started to impact their focus, their cravings, and often it can impact their cycle. And so I always say those are good ways to check in, check in on your sleep, check in on your cravings, check in on your cycle. If those things are off, you're probably going too hard. So that's my explanation of what happens with a lot of women. Now, there are often women, a small minority, but there are definitely women who can do this and who can do this for long periods of time and come to me and say, well, why should I stop if I'm feeling good? And my answer to them is, if you're feeling good, your energy levels are great, your cycles are in check, your cravings are in check, then go for it. I'm not blanketing every single woman in the world to kind of take it slow. So my advice for women is to go really low and slow and let the body and the hormones acclimate. So for example, what I like to do is circadian fasting. Circadian fasting means take the body's natural predilection towards circadian rhythms and use that to your advantage. Meaning you may start fasting after dinner, and you may not eat another snack so you stop dinner at 7 p.m. and you may not eat again until 7 a.m. And 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., just 12 hours. 12 hours of a break is even enough to start getting all the benefits of intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding. So what you start to do is you start to lower those insulin levels. You start to optimize those GI cells, because those cells in your stomach and intestine, they need a time to clean up and get reset for the day as well. If there's constantly food coming in, it's kind of like saying when you have guests constantly and you never will get a chance to do a deep cleaning or clean up your kitchen because you're constantly entertaining. So time-restricted feeding will give you that. So start with 12 hours a day and then get used to that. And then a couple of days a week, I would say 2 to 3 days a week, you can push it to a little bit longer. What a little bit longer can mean 14 or 16 hours for most women.
I love circadian synced intermittent fasting. 12 hours might sound like a long time, but stretching that between an early dinner and a late breakfast is a lot more reasonable if you make sure you're eating all 3 meals and feeling full and satisfied in that period of time. Moving on, we hit fast forward on the podcast feed to wrap this one up, landing on Austin McGuffey, aka the Metabolism Mentor, in episode 169, where Austin gave us the lowdown on his work as a content creation powerhouse focused on educating and empowering people through self-directed nutrition. So you just mentioned 3 things. You'll sit down and say, okay, there are 3 things that you can do to improve your health. What are those 3 things that you start with?
So what we just recently talked about was sleep.
Yeah.
The importance of sleep. There are a lot of studies that suggest that we are a lot more insulin resistant when we're sleep deprived. So that's a great place to start, is like getting some sleep. And then the second thing is not eating naked carbs. If you're eating carbs, you should probably pair it with some fat or some protein. I think one of the things that I love to do is, one of the things I've learned to do after monitoring my blood sugar with Levels, shout out to Levels.
Yeah, we love Levels.
Absolutely. So I like to put my food in a bowl. And so I put my carbs on the bottom, and then I'll put my protein, fat, or vegetables on top. And I start with what's on top. And then by the time I make my way to the carbohydrates, I will have already eaten my protein, fat, and fiber, or my protein and fat. And then when I get to the carbs, I can start to use my satiety signals to figure out whether or not I'm hungry and whether or not I should continue eating. And if I don't continue eating, then it's like, okay, great. I got the most nutritious part of the meal out of the way because I put it at the top of my bowl. And if I'm still hungry, great. I can enjoy the carbs because I just paired it with fat, fiber, and protein. So that's,
wow.
Yeah.
Such an easy tip though, but like so actionable, because all people need to do is start plating in a bowl. And they're going to do it, and they know your formula, and they work their way from the top to the bottom. And exactly what you're saying. We know the research tells us that eating protein first is going to slow the digestion of those carbohydrates and also be the most satisfying. Like, it's those type of simple tips where I'm already like, is there some pretty bowl pottery that I'm going to buy for my family? Because, plated on one of those like toddler silicone plates, you know that they're going to go for the grapes or the crackers or the toast first, and then
every time
what's left. Yeah.
Every single time. Yeah. That's something that I've learned personally. And that's, I think, teaching from personal experience is always the best way for the knowledge to resonate with people, at least for me. And then when you get into cultural norms and things like that, it makes it easier for people to adapt because it's, hey, that person kind of lives a life like me. And if that works for him, then maybe it'll work for me. The third thing is movement, is moving your body. I think that fitness culture has been such a wonderful thing. But it also is, it has its drawbacks because I think we've developed an all or nothing mentality where it's either 5 or 6 days in the week in the gym or no days a week in the gym. And we've completely thrown out the window how essential just general movement is throughout the day. You can go to the park and play around with your kids for 45 minutes. And that's just as effective as maybe not just as effective, but it's good enough for you to use it as your exercise for the day instead of dragging yourself to the gym, being somewhere that you don't want to be, and trying to maintain a habit that may not be sustainable for your lifestyle. And then you throw that away and you're left with nothing. So movement is so important, not just movement in general, but utilizing movement as a tool. I like to... I enjoy food, and
me too.
Just like many of us, and sometimes I eat food that so I know I shouldn't be eating. And instead of putting myself through a guilt trip or trying to completely abstain from it, knowing I'm going to relapse eventually, I use the tools that I have in my tool belt, like movement. And so if I'm eating a healthy granola bar that I know is going to spike my blood sugar, I'll just eat it while I'm walking my kid to the park. And that way I avoid the blood sugar spike and I still, met my craving for this granola bar. So it's just implementing some habits that allow me to still feel like a human being, but then that keep me at optimal levels of health at the same time.
Austin is right. We all just want to feel human, and connecting that to Max's message earlier that our baseline as humans is to be healthy, this picture becomes more clear. It's not about shaming, restricting, cutting, or worrying. When we focus on empowering ourselves with information, adding healthy foods and ingredients as best we can, and living in abundance over anxiety, we start to really feel human, and we start to feel really healthy. Now I'm painfully aware that wellness and biohacking can start to feel overwhelming. This episode, and really the whole podcast, is meant to serve as a point of reference for you. Pick whatever interests you the most and start there. You don't need to tackle it all to make an impact. Just being aware is a step in the right direction. Lastly, I want to thank our featured guests one more time for their time, experience, and energy. Here are their formal intros. Max Lugavere is a health and science journalist, filmmaker, and best-selling author. His first book, Genius Foods, a New York Times bestseller, challenged our understanding of diet's impact on brain health, while his Wall Street Journal bestseller, Genius Kitchen, married delicious recipes and his recommendations. He hosts the Genius Life podcast, one of the top health and wellness podcasts in the U.S. that commands an audience of over 1.5 million followers across social media. His contributions to various programs like The Today Show and The New York Times and appearances on The Joe Rogan Experience and The Diary of a CEO have made him a respected and well-known voice in the field. Today's guest is Dr. Amy Shah. She is a double board certified MD with training from Cornell, Columbia, and Harvard University. She was named one of Mind Body Green's top 100 women in wellness to watch in 2015 and has been a guest on many national and local media shows. She is a busy MD who focuses on gut health, inflammation, and intermittent fasting. So today we're going to go through her tips in each one of those categories. It is such a pleasure to have her on the show. Kelly McGonigal is a health psychologist and author and teacher at Stanford University. Oh, and her TED Talk has over 21 million views. Her best-selling books are based on classes at Stanford, all backed by research. Her book, The Willpower Instinct, was based on her popular psychology course, The Science of Willpower, and The Upside of Stress began as Living Well with Stress. Her latest book, and the topic of today's podcast, explores how physical exercise can be a powerful antidote to the modern epidemics of depression, anxiety, and loneliness. The book is called The Joy of Movement, and it's out New Year's Eve. I was lucky enough to get a sneak peek into this inspirational read. Kelly is also a phenomenal speaker. Recently, we both spoke up at a VC conference at Skywalker Ranch, which is a story for another day. But I had the pleasure of sitting in her lecture and left the presentation absolutely pumped to hit the gym. Not only is Kelly totally relatable, but I found the science she shared in this book and in her talk to be incredibly motivational. So if you are in a workout rut, this podcast and her new book is sure to be the perfect tool to help you get moving. Austin McGuffey, aka the Metabolism Mentor, is a content creator who is fascinated with how the human body works. He was a former personal trainer, and he leans on that experience to create videos that make the concept of metabolism easy to understand. He's a husband, a father, and creating generational health is among his top priorities. One way he's doing that is through a production company that he founded with his wife called Nourish, where they house personal brands like Metabolism Mentor and partner with companies to create entertaining and informative health content. Ultimately, he wants to instill his passion for health in others who desire to feel better but may not know where to start. His passion is supporting the Black community to understand how healthy swaps and habits can support their blood sugar balance and the prevention of chronic lifestyle diseases. Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelly. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at BeWellByKelly.com. And follow me on Instagram at BeWellByKelly. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.